Welcome to the Legacy Leaders Podcast. Are you doing the best for your client to help them create their legacy? Are you creating a plan that goes far beyond finances to help people ensure that it becomes the driving force behind all decisions? On this podcast, hosts Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller will help you with growing your practice and your clients' peace of mind. Together, they bring the best and brightest minds to share with you how to help your clients develop their best legacy. And now, here are your hosts, Katie Beth and Stan.
You're listening to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Stan Miller. Today, I'm joined by Carla Fowler. Carla is an MD, she's a PhD, and she's an elite executive coach. For the last decade, Carla has been what you might call a secret weapon for scores of CEOs, entrepreneurs, and other senior leaders. She brings a unique approach to coaching that combines the latest research from performance science with the timeless best practices to help top performers level up and achieve their goals. Carla, welcome, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Excellent, Stan. Thanks for having me.
So I've been looking forward to this interview a lot for, among other things, I would say really selfish reasons, because I think a lot of what we're going to learn today, a lot of what I'm going to learn today may be really useful to me, but I'm sure that what we're going to learn today is going to be useful to a lot of the people who are listening to this podcast. And so with that, I want to just jump right in and start off by just asking you, let's talk about executive coaching 101. What is that? What are the questions that you get most frequently, and what are the biggest misconceptions about it?
Executive coaching, how I would look at it, and there's certainly lots of different kinds of coaching. Most people are familiar with athletic coaching, but also there's sort of this range of coaching, which is about not how we perform physically, but maybe how we are performing in our life or in our work. And I would separate executive coaching from life coaching in the sense of it often has to do with how we're performing at work. And that can be anything from, if we are moving into a new position and we want to make sure we're onboarding and performing at our best as we, say, get promoted and learn that new role, or maybe even switch companies into a higher level role. But it can also be when we realize that, we're feeling a little stagnant and we're thinking like, hey, I want to think about what's my next level. How can I keep learning or growing? And then additionally, it can be maybe something's come to your attention, like an area where you're not performing as well as maybe you need to be as a leader. And so there are certain things you might want to work on. But I would say all of those are common scenarios that fall within the bucket of things that an executive coach could help you with. Now, there are all sorts of flavors of coaches. Some specialize in a niche, a particular industry or profession. Really, the kinds of coaching that I focus on have less to do with the industry that someone is in, and is really much more around I would say, people who are interested in using performance science to really go after some challenging goals that they've set for themselves. So again, there can be sort of a full range of different things that people are working on. But I would say broadly, a coach can really help be a thought partner. They can provide tools and resources, new ideas, or books of things you might try or practice with. And often they can really help you get some clarity about, what you're thinking, what you want, and where you want to be headed.
It's interesting. I've noticed that among the really serious top level high performance athletes, it's really common for those guys to have coaches. I know Tiger Woods, hired a coach to help him with his short game. Michael Jordan, I think, when he was active, had a coach. I mean, I think all of the serious professional athletes have coaches. So a way of thinking about this is not that, we're on the third rung and trying to work our way up. It's actually something that people at the very highest level of performance do, because they want to actually improve performance and move to an even higher level.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with that, Stan. And it is nice to say that out loud, actually, because I think there are a lot of ways in which we wouldn't think twice about having a coach for something athletic, but somehow we could perceive it as a feeling or a sign of weakness when we engage a coach, say for our work performance. But really having an outside thought partner can be so useful, both in identifying blind spots that someone might have, but also just getting another brain working on new ideas about, again, like other things you might try, ways you might, even if you're doing great at your job, just find new opportunities, do something in a new way that opens up just more avenues for you.
So I know you've said, and I've read, I've been on your website. I've looked at what a lot of the people that have worked with you have said, and there's some pretty glowing comments there. One of the things I noticed that you said is that high performers are just like us, except for a few surprising things they do differently. So I'm curious, actually, I'm really curious to hear what those surprising things are.
Absolutely. Well, some of the things that are the same, I'll just say a couple real fast. Like high performing people have no more time than the rest of us do, right? Like we're all stuck on that 24-hour clock. And also that means that they really have to make choices, right? It's not like there's a group of people who don't have to sort of consider trade-offs and make choices. And so one of the things I think that high-performing people really excel at is being able to see what their choices are, and own and take responsibility for their choices, and then run an iterative loop whereby they improve those choices. And so it's this idea of, things can just happen, but the ability to identify like, what is a choice I've made, and really to be able to intentionally think about that and identify that, even if it didn't go well, right? And I think those are some of the choices that many of us are like, oh, I just don't want to revisit that. I don't want to rethink about it. But I think one of the things very high-performing people do is they both see the choice, they own the choice in that they take responsibility for it. And then they're able to start to say, all right, like, what if that was just bad luck? What if that was actually, no, I could have done a better process in making that decision or executing on that particular piece. And so what am I going to change next time? Is there something worth changing about that? So I think that is definitely one of the things that comes to mind. I would say another thing is patience with playing a longer game or a longer arc. So, as human beings, we are definitely built, like our brains are built to really want some immediate gratification of things. And we do struggle with investing in something, continuing to work towards something that doesn't necessarily have, that big payout or achievement rapidly. And so I think being able to see the longer arc that comes out of some compounding effort that we're putting in is something that I think high-performing people have a little more patience with, or maybe it's vision for.
Yeah, let me personalize that for a second, okay? I know you spent a long time, going through med school, and you were well on your way to becoming a surgeon. But what you're doing now is definitely not surgery. So there's got to be a story there. At some point, you made a personal pivot away from that to do what you do now. Talk about that.
Oh, that's a great thing. Because yes, I would say that period of time where I was getting my MD and my PhD, great example of a long arc. Well, a little bit just about my background, because I came into coaching from a much different route, is that I've always been interested in math and science, but also very interested in people, like observing people, their behavior. I was always curious about performance, probably from the time I was like in 5th grade. Just like, if someone won the track meet, like, why did they win the track meet? Like, what was it they were doing that made them so good at that? And obviously, as I went along, going through undergrad, choosing to study medicine, I was still always looking and watching sort of at the meta level of like, yeah, people who are good academically or good athletically, what was helping them along. And I went into medicine because number one, it was a high performing environment. And I always was really drawn to those. Like I like to put myself through the tests, and I like to be in the arena where I could learn from other people who are also putting themselves up against this challenge. So ultimately, I think some of the things that I most enjoyed during that time of getting my MD and then also my PhD were number one, when you go into medicine, it's actually a part of our workforce where we let young people make really high stakes decisions and really be intimately involved in that process. Usually I think in corporations, you have to wait a bit longer before you get a position where you have that much autonomy and responsibility. And so one of the things that I did really enjoy was that process of how do you dialogue with someone to make a very important decision about, their health and well-being. Another piece that I really liked about that time was in the process of getting my PhD. So I was contributing and doing science. And one of the things about being a scientist is like built into the job is you walk in every day not knowing the answer. And your job is to figure out the answer. And in fact, nobody knows the answer. So it's not one of those things like medicine where often there's a book that tells you, about the disease or this or that. And so one of the things that the PhD really taught me was how do you think about an unstructured problem and give it some structure? And also, how do you develop a new relationship with uncertainty and with the unknown? Because every day of kind of walking into my PhD was, you got to figure that out. How are you going to figure out this science and learn something about it?
So is what you're talking about, this concept of performance science, which, by the way, I'm not familiar with that. So in fact, I didn't know that it was a science.
Yes, great question. So performance science, I loosely think of it as all the different disciplines that are actually contributing to the pool of ideas of how do we as human beings perform at our best. Clearly, there are some ideas that are physiological and more related to our athletic performance, but there are also a lot of contributors to how we think. How do we do our best thought performance? For example, how can you be successful as a startup founder, in a competitive market with a new idea? So I would say it's contributed to by sociology, psychology. I think the business schools and their thoughts on strategy play in. But I look at it as kind of a big bucket of all of these ideas. And notably, two of the themes we were just talking about, like how do you make a high stakes decision? What is a good process for that? Would be a great example of something that there is science and things to inform what makes that go. Similarly, how do we as human beings handle something that's uncertain? We like to have control. Like our brains were built to like control. Sure. And so when you're trying to go do something new or innovative, how does one combat that mental sense of like, I don't like this. I wish I had more control. I wish I knew what the outcome was. So just to bring that back, these are some of the ideas that might exist within performance science and why it would be relevant to then, as you're coaching people who are setting, highly ambitious goals where there may be a lot of uncertainty. It has a lot of resources and tools and ideas that can be very useful then as you're working with people to try and do that.
Yeah. So I'm sure that in the context of the work you do, you're able to see a lot of things that people do that really work. I'm guessing also that you get to see some things that don't work. So what are some of the mistakes that you see people make where they sabotage their own performance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So, and I often think of these as like a mistake. And then there's also sort of the principle of what I think is helpful in terms of doing better in that area. So I think one of the first big mistakes that people make is that we don't get to clarity or spend time thinking about what is it we really want to have happen? So like, what's the goal? What's the result or the outcome you're looking for? And often it's for a good reason we make this mistake. Like we sometimes have an action bias. We jump in, we really start working towards something. And the point isn't that one should think forever before you're ready to get going on something. But, we do have limited time, and we have to really direct that time towards what's going to give us the biggest impact. And it turns out to make some of those trade-off decisions, we really have to think about, well, what is it we want as the outcome? And what are the most important parts of that? And so one of the performance science principles that I have sort of distilled that I think is really important is this idea of brutal focus. And brutal focus is saying, or really asking yourself, what do I want? What do I want to have happen? And spend some time thinking about that. And then the second piece is to say, I know I'm not going to do it all. Like that's not the best use of resources. And there really isn't enough time to do everything that one might do to get that outcome. And so given that, the second question that becomes really important to think about is, what are really the most important levers or priorities to help me work towards that outcome over time? And so that's both sort of the mistake, but then also how I approach that in coaching is really to think about brutal focus. How do you help people get clarity about those questions as they're starting, so that as they start executing, basically their actions are more potent?
And so, you talk about, you branded this, but you call it Carla's top 3 principles from performance science. Is that what we're talking about here?
That is exactly what we're talking about. Yes. Yeah. So brutal focus is number 1. And we've talked a little bit about that. Yeah.
So what would number 2 and 3 be?
Yeah. Number 2, and again, so helping people get to clarity, I think, is one of the benefits of my coaching. That's number 1. Number 2 is really this idea about learning to cultivate power or influence for yourself. And because once you sort of understand what you want, what's most important for getting there, then you have to start to enter the question of execution. And often we're actually executing not just by ourselves, but we're executing through a team. And so learning how we increase both our capabilities. Sometimes it's our resources. So that could be both financially, but it also can be what is our network or other kinds of connections or assets. And then I think the third piece of that can really be, how are we raising our visibility? So one of the interesting pieces about performance is that there's our results that we actually produce, but there's a second piece that becomes really important, particularly in arenas where objective performance is harder to measure. And that is that the visibility with the network matters a lot in those areas. So not just, what are the results you're producing, but who has seen them, who has appreciated them, and who has connected them to you. And so it's often, sometimes I will talk with folks who are like, I'm delivering all this great work, but I'm not getting promoted, or I don't feel like it's being noticed. And so that's an area then where we can work on their visibility, like that piece of cultivating power is what's missing. So that's number 2.
Yep.
And then number 3 is this idea of learning to relish uncertainty. So that is the third principle. It's very much about
let's talk about how we do that. Yeah, how do we do that?
Excellent. So relishing uncertainty is one of those interesting things because, as we said, as human beings, we like to have control. And so, but one of the things that I say about uncertainty is that it often is a marker for where there is growth or opportunity to be had. And so we often equate uncertainty with risk, with, this overinflated sense of like, if it's uncertainty or uncertain, then the outcome's going to be bad. But actually, if you look back at maybe areas of your life that you grew the most or that you felt the most proud of an accomplishment, there often was some uncertainty involved in the run-up for that. And as a result, I like to encourage people to reflect on that, but then also to look forward and where there is uncertainty to acknowledge that, well, that actually is a marker of something good that could happen, both as a result, but also good in terms of the growth that I go through and the person I become in the process. So I also remind people that there's more than one good way to get somewhere. And there's also more than one good place to get to, as a piece of, again, building sort of a mindset of being able to be more comfortable with uncertainty. And then the final thing, which is sort of from my science days, is I encourage people to run good experiments. And so again, when I was training in science, every day you would run experiments and you didn't know what the answer was going to be, if it was going to be sort of what you had predicted or if it was going to be different. But it was a really good tool to always set things up to say, I need to learn something out of this, even if it doesn't turn out the way I hope it will. And we need to make sure the experiment itself has a balanced upside and downside. And so I use these principles to help people think about how they could run an experiment and sort of craft that uncertainty a little more so that they would learn something so that it was balanced in terms of its risk or its benefit. And I think it also just gives people a different mental framework to be curious about the answer versus worried about the answer. So that's sort of a final tool that I often use.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So you've been at this now for a while, right? And so as I understand it, you've developed some tools that you routinely use with every high performing client. I don't know if the one you just talked about is one of those, but yeah, just briefly tell me what are those tools?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two tools for different situations that I find are very helpful and almost universally applicable to folks. So the first one is really about getting clarity. So when we were talking about brutal focus, we are asking the questions, what do I want? And also, what do I think is most important for getting there? And so I use a tool that I call a 139 strategic framework. And this is it's an in-depth process I use with every new client, but it's actually something you can do at home, and an abbreviated version of it that's really helpful. So really, the first thing I do is the 139 is just to think about, what is your goal? You could even pick one area of your life. It doesn't have to be your goal for everything, just some area of your life or your work. And try and put some words on paper to what it is you want to have happen. Sometimes that might have numbers or timelines associated with it, sometimes not. But I just tell people to write it as specifically as they can, such that if they had to explain it to someone else and hand it off, that other person would be able to sort of understand it clearly enough to go do the thing. It's like give someone a recipe. And then the second thing I have people do is think about that goal and start to brain dump everything important that they think might be involved in that. Sometimes that's things you already know. For example, if you were like, I want to run a marathon. I want to run a marathon this year. I want to run that marathon, in less than, let's say, 5 hours. And that's what I would like to do. So then in the second step, when you're trying to say, well, what's really most important about doing that? You might write down things you already know. Okay, I need to run a lot. All right, well, that's good. I know that there might be training programs that I could get online. I could get a coach. I probably need to eat a little better to fuel, and maybe I need to get some more sleep or something. So you can start to write down these things. And then I often find it's useful to group them into themes to try and pull out, like, what are the three sort of maybe most important priorities that are related to this? For example, one might be time to train. Like, I need to figure out how to protect time to train. I know I'll do the training if I have time, but if I have not made time, no amount of wanting to do the training will make it happen. So I often find that when you start to group into themes and really get back to sort of the baseline or foundational pieces, it becomes clear, like, what's really needed to make this happen? Maybe it's, hey, I need help. I need help with the kids. So that I can take some time to do this thing, or I need to, make sure my work is fitting between 8 and 5 to get this thing done. So anyways, you can often find what those are. And I find it's very helpful to then just say, all right, then based on those priorities, what are the things I need to do first? So that's just the start of that tool. And you can certainly break the priorities down even further and to get sort of 9 in total. But that's one of the tools I like to use with folks.
Yeah, that's great. So tell me, if I were interested in having a working, a client relationship with you, or if somebody who's listening to this podcast wanted to have a relationship, what would that look like? And I'm not talking about the investment, because I know, you do charge to do this, and I think your website speaks to that. But what does the relationship look like in terms of time commitment? What's the arc of time for it? What's that like?
Great question. So I always start my engagements really working on that clarity question, or that brutal focus question. And so I start each engagement with an onboarding session that is 5 hours in length. And it's really a dialogue. So most people say it actually flies by. But what it helps us do is create that 139 framework, explore their goals, understand what's really most important that they need to invest in priority-wise to get to those goals. And that's how we build our roadmap to start. And I have found that this actually builds a ton of momentum for people, even before they've been able to start putting in effort. Because when we have mental clarity, taking action becomes much easier. And it's actually something I do that's a little different than many coaches who start sort of 1 hour at a time. So we really front load at the beginning. And then after that, generally speaking, an initial engagement would be 6 months. And often that's meeting every other week, or weekly for some folks who are very clear they want that. But we do essentially 1 hour sessions over that time. And what we do then in those sessions is we're able to figure out what is getting in the way of those priorities, or help build momentum on those things, figure out next steps, and just help them feel really comfortable investing in those goals over time. So just referencing back to this idea of how do we play the long game, because that's often really important in high performance. It's not a sprint, it's often a marathon. And so that's sort of how my coaching process helps support that type of curve for folks. So that's often what it looks like to start.
And I'm guessing all that's done virtually in most cases, right?
Yes. Yeah, I work with folks across North America, Canada, and the US. And I love that, because again, it just means if someone wants to work with me, it doesn't matter where they are.
Yeah, I love that too. And it's a new kind of a new day for us, right? But how liberating for us to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So Carla, great talking to you today. Let me ask you, are there any questions that I didn't ask you that I should have asked?
Oh, that's a great question. Let's see.
Well, maybe not. Maybe I asked
yeah.
all the questions, but just in case, I want to get that out there.
Yeah. I think that for many folks, the biggest thing that we do with performance is we get really stuck on a silver bullet or a hack. And so maybe it's not a question, but just as sort of a parting word, when we start to think about performance, I actually think some of it is actually fairly basic, in the sense of nobody else has a silver bullet. High-performing people are not doing something magic that you don't have access to. Of course, all of us have different amounts of innate talent in different areas, but I see that a lot of it comes back to having clarity about what you want, being willing to do some of that thought work up front. Number 2, really being willing to make some trade-offs. We don't have time to do it all. And so being willing to say, no, I'm not going to do it perfect. It's going to be a little messy, in fact, but I know if I invest over time, and really compound on things that are priorities and that in fact are the big levers, that I will make progress towards where I want to go. And then I think the third piece is that you're never going to know it all before you go. And so you often have to get started before you know all the answers or know how something's going to work. And so again, this idea of like relishing uncertainty, run some experiments, but have a sense of like where you want to go and a starting place of what you think is most important. And you can always change that as you go along. In fact, I think some of the highest performers are continually iterating to figure out what is working in that next chapter. So that might just be the last thing, is like nobody else has a silver bullet. So if you're really investing in those foundational elements, you're on the right track.
Terrific. I think that's a great way to wrap this up. So let me just say thank you all for listening. This is the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Stan Miller. My guest today was executive coach Carla Fowler. For more information on Carla and the work that she does, you can visit www.THAXA, that's spelled THAXA, THAXA.com. We're also going to link this, her web address in the show notes for you. Carla, it's been a pleasure having you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Stan. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller. For more information on them and the show, please visit pinnaclelegacylaw.com. If you like what you've learned today, do share the program with your friends and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.